Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Priceless Podcast. Today, with a new topic and something pretty new and different from what we had until now. But before we get into the interview, I want to say that this podcast is made in partnership with the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. If you want to support this podcast and or the European Forum, of course, then you can find all the necessary information in the podcast description, as well as the links that might come up during this interview. So today we're actually going to talk about something exciting that's happening and that was started and fundraised by the European Forum, and it's about a research. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it because my guests are going to say all the things that are necessary to say. Today with me, I don't have just one guest. I don't have two guests. I have three amazing guests with me. One of them is Research Officer Rachel Stockdale. Another one is Rein Brouwer. He's Associate Professor of Practical Theology. And Helene Zorgdrager, I'm doing my best that I can with these names, Professor of Systematic Theology and Gender Studies. Welcome everyone to this podcast, and thank you so much for doing this with me. How are you doing today?
Fine, thank you.
Well, our guests probably don't know you. I met you myself for the first time. I actually had the pleasure to exchange a few emails with Rachel. So for the first time, I saw her face, and there is finally someone behind the name and emails that I got. Could you introduce yourselves with a few sentences for our audience?
Sure, will I go first?
Yes, you can go first.
Great. Thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to do this podcast. My name's Rachel Stockdale, and I'm the Research Officer at the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. For this project, RISE, I'm from the north of Ireland, and I'm in the final stages of completing my PhD at Queen's University Belfast, and I'm just really happy to be here this morning.
Thank you for being here. Helene, would you go next?
Yeah, with pleasure. I'm a professor of systematic theology and gender studies at the Protestant Theological University in Amsterdam. And my research interest is in sexuality and all issues connected to gender. A great interest of me is Eastern Europe. Already for a long time, I'm a visiting professor to the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, and so I'm happy to have been also introduced to the world of Eastern Christianity.
Thank you, Helene. Rein?
Yes, I'm a colleague of Helene at the same theological university in Amsterdam. And I've done some researches on churches, particularly in Western Europe and the Netherlands. But Helene invited me to be part of this research and to look together at the empirical part of the research. And that has been so far a great pleasure and a very interesting journey, to say the least.
So for the start, our viewers don't even know, probably some maybe know, but don't know what we are talking about. So maybe this is a part for you, Rachel, as a research officer, to say, what is this research? What is it called? And what would you say about this research to our audience? How would you explain it?
Yeah, well, certainly I can give the very basic definition, and then my colleagues can expand upon that perhaps, but basically the aim, RICE is the Rainbow Index of Churches in Europe. So the aim of the research is really to rate the inclusivity of churches by country in regard to LGBTQI plus people in Europe. So it's a joint project that we're doing together with our academic partners, the European Forum, with the academic partners, to really create this index and have, this piece of research that will really be, it's very exciting because it's really the first of its kind here in Europe, and it's actually making history in a way. So we're all really excited to, present the results and share what we've found with all of you. But I would say that's the basic definition of what RICE is.
Thank you. Would you add anything, Rein or Helene?
Well, maybe a short thing. One of the things that sort of inspired us as researchers, but probably also the EF, is the ILGA Europe Index. And the EF asked us to do something like that for the churches. And I think that's what we've done. We thought about indicators that would say something, or maybe say a lot, about the inclusivity of LGBTI people in European churches. And based on these indicators, we came with a sort of a scoring list. And based on this scoring list, we came to a ranking of these European churches.
Yeah, so the main question was, how inclusive are European churches towards LGBTI people? And first we had to find out, what do we understand by inclusivity, and how do we measure it? And so we started with not only a sociological definition of inclusiveness, but also a theological inclusivity definition. So being inclusive as a church means to meet a high standard, because the hospitality of Jesus, the fellowship of the table of Jesus is very radical. So how do churches practice this in their policies towards LGBTI people, also, how do they not only practice it towards the LGBTI people in their midst, but also in society? So also externally in their public policies, are they inclusive in a way that they support the human rights situation of LGBTI people in their societies? So we measured it, the policies, the practices inside and outside the churches, inward and outwardly. And for that we constructed a list of indicators that aimed to measure the extent of inclusiveness.
Well, I have to say I had the pleasure to read. I didn't have the time to read everything, but I think I went through most of it for this interview. And I have to say it's really interesting. So as soon as this research is available, I'm really suggesting you to take a look at it, because it was even fun to read, to kind of find out all, from different countries and from different denominations, and the background and what is happening actually nowadays with all these churches. So how does one go about, what kind of methodology did you use? How did you get to the information that you needed for this research?
Shall I start with that? Well, the thing that we also started as within the research is to come up with this list of indicators. We talked about this list and all these different indicators extensively with the people from the EF, because we wanted to get the indicators as sharply as possible, and also providing them as much information that we want to get. And that was a sort of it took a lot of time and a lot of effort to come at the right formulations and sort of finding enough indicators to cover the whole of the phenomenon of inclusivity of LGBTI people in European churches. So we ended up with 47 indicators. And 47 is a bit of an odd number. At one point, we said, let's say 40. That's a nice biblical number, but, well, we ended up with 47. And the 47 indicators sort of are the same as 100% of the inclusivity. So it's a way of measuring it. From the beginning, we thought there would be probably no European church that will score 100%, meaning 47 points. At the end, we had one church that had 45.5, so there's one church that scores quite high. But then we started to sort of bring these 47 indicators in 4 categories. And as Helene talked a bit about it, the first category was about, let's say, the church law, the basic fundamentals of the church. The second category is about the practices of the church, which people are not allowed to go into seminary and become ministers or priests, or are people allowed to participate in the Eucharist, or are they baptized? So these practices questions are in the second category. The third category is about speech, language. How inclusive is the speech and the language of, in particular, the leaders in the churches? And the fourth category is about what sort of public statements made church leaders about LGBTI issues. And so the 47 indicators are divided on 4 categories. Every indicator was translated in a question. They could be scored with 0 point, half a point, or 1 point. And if you scored on 47 indicators, 47 questions, 1 point, you got 47 points, and that is a sort of a 100 percentage. But the other point, but maybe my colleagues like to say something about that, was the involvement of co-researchers. So maybe Helene likes to talk a bit about that.
Shall I take over? That was very important to make that choice, to use the lived experiences of LGBTI Christians as the main resource to get the data. And why? We could have gone to the churches and to ask the officers of the churches, so please fill in this list of indicators and how do you think you will perform? But there we had our hesitations because we do not know what kind of image the church wants to give of itself. And we think for an issue as this, LGBTI inclusion in churches, it is very important to start with the lived experiences of the groups involved. And it's not only about their experiences of inclusion and, in many cases, exclusion, so feelings of pain, hurt, being excluded, being outcasted in the church. That, of course, that sharps your perspective, but it's also that we acknowledge their expertise. It is experience, and this experience also leads to expertise, because our co-researchers, the groups of the European Forum in the different countries, the local groups, they are very well informed, and they have the information and the data we were searching for, the important documents, the public statements, if there are any. They could provide us with this because it relates to them, and we have used their experience to the utmost. And to be not perhaps too subjective in gathering the information, the documents that are provided are used also to objectivize the data. So there are objective documents, church orders, public statements, and that tell about the situation. And this is the way we work together with the co-researcher local groups in the different European countries.
Thank you. So You said something, you mentioned that you didn't ask the churches to answer these questions for now. Does that mean that there are some plans for the future to do it with churches? Do you know anything about that? Or would you like to do it?
We don't have such a plan, but first we want to wait for the responses of the churches to this report. This is a research report. It comes into the open, and we will invite all the churches to respond to it and to give their opinion and to say, well, do we recognize ourselves? What can we learn from this report? And this is the way we hope to engage the church leadership.
Mm.
Yeah, one of the things that I would like to add is maybe two short things is one of the families of church families, so to speak, is the European Commission of Churches, the CEC or the CEC. And interestingly is that this European Conference of Churches covers a lot of these different churches that are involved, or the data on these churches are a part of our research. But the CEC doesn't have a sort of a policy on LGBTI issues. Mm. And I think that our research provides them with some serious questions in that regard. So that might be an interesting thing for them to comment on or to react on or take it up. Another thing that I would like to add is that next year, in 2022, there will be a next assembly of the World Council of Churches. And already for a couple of years, Christian LGBTI organizations are sort of making their way to this assembly and sort of putting the LGBTI issues on the agenda of the World Council of Churches. And hopefully our research could also play a little part in that.
Mm. Mm. So my next question is actually for all of you, if you would like to answer, and that is, when you were done with the research, was there anything that surprised you out of this research, and what was it and why did it surprise you?
Maybe you first, Rachel?
I suppose not. It's not that it surprised me, but I really, we were all working very closely with the co-researchers. As my colleagues were saying, the co-researchers were really essential in order to do this research. It just wouldn't have been possible without the co-researchers. And the responses that we received, I mean, people really put in so much time and effort, and we really want to say a huge thank you for that, because it really, really was amazing, the responses we get. And I wouldn't say that I was surprised at that, but we were so grateful for that. And not only just, first of all, me reaching out to people as the research officer, sort of recruiting, you could say, the co-researchers, but completing the questionnaires. And then after that, it wasn't even finished. There was some back and forth. We also worked with the working groups, two working groups in particular, the Orthodox working group and the Roman Catholic working group of the European Forum. And there was a dialogue going on there, back and forth. It was really important for us to have this community engagement in our research. And we just were really, really taken aback by how much people really took on this research and, really took it so seriously and helped us so much with this. And that's why we say co-researchers, because it's really everyone's research that we have done together in creating this, groundbreaking research, the first of its kind. So I'm not sure if I would say it surprised me as such, but it was a very pleasant, a very pleasant consequence of this research was to see that it wasn't so difficult to engage people, and that people were forthcoming with their help and just wanted to do as much as they could to get this research together, because it's important to have this across the board, not just for Christians, for non-Christians. It's important to have this research there as a base that we can then fall back on that whenever it comes to, equality and diversity in any of these things. So people really took on the importance of that, and for that we're really grateful.
So thank you all who are watching this podcast and who contributed to this. Thank you for doing this, for such an important document that you were willing to cooperate.
I could mention some surprising outcomes. Surprising for me was that some Roman Catholic churches scored really well. And I leave this further to Rijn, because he specialized more or less in the Roman Catholic churches' scores. The Orthodox churches, they had a score in average of 5 points out of the possible 47, and the Roman Catholic 11. So that is a difference. Another surprising outcome, perhaps not so surprising, but that some Protestant churches, it is expected that some score quite high, and we know the examples, but there were some that were very, very low. To mention just two of them, the Lutheran Church of Latvia and the Reformed Church of Hungary, they were very, very low in comparison to the family of the Lutheran churches, of the Reformed churches otherwise. And then as a third surprising outcome, that the churches across the board do not score very well on a public statement. So that means on supporting the human rights of LGBTI people in societies. Their churches really lack effort and lack a voice in society. That was surprising for me as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I looked in particular at the church family of Catholic churches, Roman Catholic churches, which I'm not in particular knowledgeable about before this research. And what I find interesting in the research is the difference in positions, and also the scoring, and also the ranking of these Roman Catholic churches per country. For instance, there are some Roman Catholic churches in some European countries that score quite well, quite good. For instance, Malta. Malta is, as a country, is also scoring quite high quite high, the highest at the ILGA Europe ranking. But also the Roman Catholic Church in Malta is scoring in the top of our ranking list, so to say. But also Germany. And the lowest scoring Roman Catholic Church in Europe is the church in Poland. And there is a huge difference. And also the specific information the co-researchers provided us with sort of makes it quite clear where these differences are coming from. An interesting question for us, and that's maybe something for a follow-up, is what is the deciding factor in this all? Is it the particularity of the bishops in one country that are more, let's say, more or less anti-LGBTI than in other countries? Or is it the national politics that is also influencing the church? Or is the church influencing national politics, for instance, in Poland? But it has also something to do probably with the particular structure of particular churches in countries. For instance, the Roman Catholic churches in Switzerland and also in Germany, they have a sort of a dual structure of the clerical part, but also a part where lay people are represented. And the clerical part consists, of course, out of men and men who are not open about their gayness, for instance. But the lay participants, these are women, LGBTI people, often openly LGBTI people, and they sort of, that's at least these are my word, they sort of correct the policy and practices in these churches. So I think that's also the reason why in Germany you can look at how the synod of the bishops in Germany, how they try to look forwards and be progressive in these issues, and how they sort of were quite disappointed about the latest decision by the Congregation of the Defense of the Faith with regard to LGBTIQ. So you see a sort of a discussion going on within the Roman Catholic Church, and I think that's very interesting, definitely for the near future.
Looks like what it sounds to me from what you're saying is that it's really of great importance that LGBTI people within the church do their work, whatever that means, or just be active and advocate for their rights and the rights of other LGBTI people.
Yeah, definitely. But you should also say that in some of these churches, not only Roman Catholic churches, but also churches, Orthodox churches, and even Protestant churches, sometimes LGBTI people don't get the chance to do that.
Yeah.
But if they get some chance to do that, they know what they need to do, I think.
Yeah.
For the Orthodox churches, there is the difference between minority churches and majority churches. So the minority churches score better. There is the exception of Finland as an Orthodox church that is really into dialogue with LGBTI people in their midst, and where LGBTI people can be open and contribute as theologians to the church discussions. So that makes a good example of how an Orthodox church can be more open towards diversity inside its own midst and towards diversity inside its own tradition. That also makes a difference for Orthodox churches who base themselves on the traditions, the church fathers, and that the churches that state there's only one opinion in the whole church tradition, and that is that homosexuality is not allowed, it is a sin, etc. In these churches there is no movement, there is not a theological dialogue going on, and in the churches that allow for more openness towards the church tradition with the capital, this makes it more interesting for all people to get involved in issues of gender and sexuality, that makes a difference between Finland, perhaps also Estonia. I don't mean the Estonian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, but the Estonian Church under the Constantinople Patriarchate. There is such a discovery going on, a journey. And I think this is what we are aiming at with this research as well, to stimulate the churches and groups within these churches to go on this journey and to discover together the richness of Christian tradition when it comes to invitations of inclusiveness, of sharing the table, sharing the resources, sharing the goodness of creation, etc.
You said something very interesting when you said minority churches are more open. And I see this phenomenon in Croatia, which was part of Yugoslavia and a communist country, and where the church was, let's say, discriminated against. And it was very different. I have friends who are theologians and said theology back then was so much different. It was so much open-minded, and you were talking about different topics, but now it's so much geared towards like a common aim, which has a lot to do with nationalism and preserving nationalist values, if we can call them like that. So do you have a clue also, as professors and students of theology, like, do you have a clue about why is that the church just changes this much when it becomes more, if it has more of a majority and more people or even more power?
Yeah, this is matching the outcomes of our research. We have a chapter which we called, what makes this group of churches? They all have to do with the so-called traditional values. And these traditional values are related to nationalism, to a strong state, to authoritarian leadership, and in these churches and in these countries, the situation for LGBTI people, both in the state and in the church, is very bad. We could have grouped more churches into this chapter, but we selected 3, and these are Russia, Hungary, as countries, Russia, Hungary, and Poland. And here you see exactly what you were just picturing, the relation between nationalism and the strong state, and the non-openness to diversity and to discussion and dialogue. I think it has to do with order, patriarchal order, authoritarian order, and the traditional values. This whole narrative about that there needs to be a hierarchical order with some powerful person on top, whether it is the president, the father, the party, and all others objected. And sexual diversity cannot be arranged and well ordered beneath this order. It can only be denied. It can only be suppressed and oppressed as the other. And all these systems, they need another. And I think, both LGBTI people and women, feminist women who do not go along with the traditional values agenda, they are now the other in these countries. So the issues of sexuality and gender are really prior to the agendas of democracy and of human rights. And I think our research confirms it.
Do anyone of you two want to add something or say something?
Well, we looked also specifically at the majority churches, so not as specifically at the minority churches, but they are also part of the research as such. But we looked at the majority churches, and then you see that in the there is a difference, a significant difference, I would say, even between the churches in Northern and Western Europe and the churches in Eastern Europe. And also churches in Northern and Western Europe, some of the churches are majority churches, for instance, in Sweden. And the church in Sweden, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Sweden, is scoring on top of our list. So that would mean that the majority church is doing the right thing, so to speak. But again, referring to Poland, for instance, or Russia, then the majority church is doing, not such a good thing. And of course, the interesting question is, what is the sort of causal relation between church and country? Helene said something about that. Is it because Sweden is so progressive in a way that also the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Sweden is also progressive, and in Poland the other way around? We're not completely clear about that. I don't think our research provides us with arguments or evidence that go one way or the other. But in a way, it might be a sort of disappointing that there is, as far as I recollect now, we don't find a situation where the country is going one way and the church is going another way. I mean, the country is repressing LGBTI rights, but the church the majority church is going towards a more positive way. So the church is falling together with the nation in most of the majority churches countries, and well, that's how it is, and that in a way that's disappointing. So I think there's a lot of homework to do for a lot of churches.
Yeah.
But are they willing and able to do that homework? So what are the forces working within the church and also externally on the churches to stay in a certain field of argument or something like that? Yeah.
And I would simply add, as Ren was saying, with the political situation in the country, and also as Helene was saying with the othering, I think, that was why it was so important with the co-researchers who really know best of all. They are the experts in those subtleties of the, local realities of their churches, because, in certain areas, for example, whether it's a conflict or post-conflict region, whether there's other debates going on in that country, it could be that at that moment in time, there's a lot of political going on with, LGBT people, for example. That could be, the spotlight could be on that. In other countries, there could be other issues. There's certain countries where there's investigations going into racism within the church. There's certain countries where the other could be considered migrants and refugees. People's attention going in different ways. There's different focus points for othering as such as well. So I think that was also why it was so important to really hear from the people who are on the ground, living and experiencing and really knowing the situation and those nuances and subtleties that we wouldn't know, even if we are experts in theology, we wouldn't know those realities unless we really knew the local situation. So I think the different focus points of those churches in those regions is really a contributing factor to that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it the way you did it, and also thank you for just disproving my thoughts, disproving my thoughts that minority churches are always a problem, but they're not. So there are examples where it's not. I guess Malta is also the Catholic Church is the majority church as much as
no, it's as we see it is we call majority churches churches that represent more than 55% of the population, and Malta is definitely a Roman Catholic majority church. Or Malta has a Roman Catholic majority church. Yeah.
Yes, and it's pretty open towards LGBTI people,
it is.
Which is
it's remarkable. I think that was one of the first surprises for me, because we were quite interested at least I was interested how the RCC, the Roman Catholic Church in Malta, would score in relation to the ILGA Europe score, but they were up to par, so to speak. Interestingly.
Yeah, and what you, Rachel, said, this is what it makes so exciting, to hear from the people, their living experiences. And that's what I read in the research, it's really, it kind of shows this lived experience. That's why it made it so interesting to read, at least for me. I don't know, Helene, did you want to add something at one moment? I don't know
about the minority church. So from Hungary, we have the data of 4 churches: the Roman Catholic, the Reformed Church, the Lutheran Church, and the Evangelical Fellowship, which is a small church in the Methodist tradition. And this latter church, the Evangelical Fellowship, they present an alternative in the rather depressive Hungarian situation, where also the national legislation is restraining the rights of LGBTI people. And the 3 bigger churches, they keep quiet. They do not defend the rights of LGBTI. Not at all. So silently they seem to approve that transgenders are curtailed in their rights, and that adoptions are not allowed anymore for LGBTI parents. But there is one church, minority church, but they present an alternative, and they made a public statement. They called it the Advent Statement, and in this they made very clear that they do not go along with the new type of liberty, that the Christian liberty that the Hungarian government represents, and the Christian liberty against Islam and against this and that and against Western Europe. They call it is not the Christian freedom. And in this statement, they mention very clear the rights of gender, of women, the rights of LGBT people to be part of the society, to be part of the church. And this is a good alternative how a minority church uses its minority status to be more free, not being captivated by the powers, but to be free to speak, and to speak really freely, advocating for those who are in the weaker positions.
Yeah, but maybe I can give also another example just to underline how difficult it is for minority churches to take a different position within a specific country. For instance, the Unitarian Church in Romania. That's also it is a minority church, quite small church. The Unitarian Church in Romania is an Hungarian-speaking church. There's a lot to do, of course, with the politics in Europe after the First and Second World War. But the Unitarians, Hungarian-speaking Unitarians in Romania, they are part of the Unitarian and Universalist church family, so to speak. And the Unitarian Universalist church family worldwide is quite progressive on LGBTI issues. And a couple of years ago, the Unitarian Church in Romania, I stress again, the Hungarian-speaking church in Romania, they sort of withdraw from making a quite daring public statement on LGBTI issues. And I think that probably has a lot to do with the situation in Hungary and the influence of Hungary on the Hungarian population in Romania. But it shows how churches need to sort of deal with church family issues, but also nationalistic issues. And when even minority churches in those situations come up and say something quite daring on LGBTI issues, they need to be lauded for that. I would say that takes a lot of courage.
Yeah.
In general, I'm a straight man. I've never been involved in research on LGBTI issues before. So it was, for me, as I said, a very, very interesting journey, and I learned a lot. I'm so deeply impressed by the courage of a lot of LGBTI people to stand up against your church, against your national policy, and say, this is our right, and we claim our right. So to hold your ground, to stand your ground, it was for me deeply impressive how people find the courage to do that. And
Thank you for these words. Well, I want to ask you, I know there were so many indicators. I mean, 47 you had. But can you give an overview of the indicators and what you would really find important to point out from the indicators and what they showed?
Yeah, of course, it's a bit difficult because of the
I know,
the 47s.
There are so many.
Yeah. So what Helene said on the public statements, that's so there are not many churches that sort of come out in public and say we support this policy, or we challenge this policy by our government. So that's something to be desired for. one of the important things is, of course, are people allowed to be part of seminary and to become priests? That's in particular, of course, mostly for women, but also openly gay men and women. So these were for us important indicators, so to speak. But it is the overall image that all the indicators together create. So that's why we have a scoring and also a ranking. And we looked at we sort of compared some of the indicators on the different churches. But maybe Helene can say something on that, because he did that on the Orthodox churches and the Protestant churches, to compare indicators and see which indicators score better or worse on particular churches.
I would like to mention the indicators on language and speech. So, is there inclusive language in liturgy, or do church leaders use inclusive language when they speak in public? And how important it is that even if there are 5 bishops and only 2 of them have inclusive language, use inclusive language, mention in a positive way or in a neutral way LGBTI, how important this is, because that already makes the picture more diverse and gives the openness for other people to feel, oh, we do belong, and it is not a uniform block against us. And so some Orthodox churches and some of our co-researchers can mention these examples from Orthodox leadership, where a metropolitan or a bishop is more inclusive in his language. And this is so important, and so important that we also present this in the research, because that is a factor of transformation. And also the indicators on baptism and Eucharist. So these are the practices in which the Church, shares the grace of God to the members, to the world. But then to see that there are churches who are putting restrictions and conditions to baptism and to Eucharist. So putting restrictions to the grace of God. Okay, God is gracious, but not to you. Not if you lead this lifestyle, not if you have these desires, not if you live in these relationships. So we singled that out, and it is all in the research that some churches really have the open and graceful attitude that belongs to a church, I would say, to an inclusive church, and others, even in the past 5 or 10 years, made restrictions specifically for homosexual people, for instance. And this is very telling, because it was never in the church rules. And now it gets a place in a pastoral letter or in some church order. And this is, I think, these are the signs that it is not getting better everywhere, and that the struggle is not yet fought, and that a lot of pain is still caused to the people. So I fully agree with how Rijn explained it. I'm also impressed by the dedication with which people stay inside their church and continue to fight for an inclusive church, for a real community. And this also struck me when we had a meeting with the Roman Catholic Working Group of the European Forum, and how they told us that filling in the questionnaire really caused them pain, because it confronted them with the reality that the church perhaps in their local situation was not so bad, and they felt part of the community. But when they looked at the official and the formal situation, then the score was almost every time 0 against 0, and that it brought them to tears. to see that this is how the church presents itself towards me, my life, me being a Christian in this church. So that is all beneath the research.
Yeah, maybe also to add another point also from the Roman Catholic Church family, adding to the point that Helene is making, is for instance the situation of the Roman Catholic Church in Poland. The co-researcher who provided us with excellent information on the Roman Catholic Church in Poland could also do that because the Bishop Conference in Poland only last year presented a document in which they sort of exposed their policy and practices. He said, in a way, I was quite glad with this document because now I can show what the church is about in my country. Of course, it's quite painful and hurting, but in a way, there is such a document, and some of the churches. Some of the Roman Catholic churches in other European countries don't have such an explicit exposing document, and then it's more difficult to really understand in details what is the position of the church, or is it the position of this archbishop or this cardinal, or is it the whole church? So such an explicit document is also in a way helpful to expose the church, but the church exposes itself, of course, in this way. Yeah.
Rachel, did you want to say something?
Yes, I suppose as Helene was speaking there, what came to mind for me was that saying, you can't be what you don't see. And that really, I mean, even in the churches that scored higher in the index, what you see sometimes is, okay, for gay men and lesbians, perhaps there's some conversation, there's some movement there. But then we're also thinking about it, from an intersectional approach across the board. So what about the bisexual people? What about the trans people? What about the non-binary people, intersex people, and even when you're making some progress, some steps in one direction, it's really about not letting those others fall behind. And again, of course, it really was very difficult for some of our co-researchers when they were faced with those realities. And basically, that there are moments in this research when we're celebrating, and then there's also moments when, we're realizing that the situation is not very good or is actually very bad. But as my colleagues were saying, there is a big difference between the official documents and the reality on the ground. And a lot of our co-researchers were saying to us, but in terms of pastoral care, it might not be an official document, but actually we, the lay people, are making a huge difference here. And we are church. What is church? We are church. We are, we the people are church. And that was fascinating for me to hear as well. And just one last thing that came to mind there was, I remember a co-researcher said to me, in my particular church, there's no official document that says that I can get married or that I can have a blessing with my partner. But I have a friend in a neighboring country whose church officially says that, but he lives in a rural area and he just can't find a minister who will actually feel comfortable doing that, even though it's in the official church documents that is allowed. So that also opened our eyes, I think, to the realities of the importance of, pastoral care. And it's not always just about what is in the official church documents, the legal documents, but also what's actually happening on the ground. And that comes back again to the expertise of our co-researchers and their actual lived experiences.
Yeah,
pastoral practices are definitely ways to broaden the scope or the playing field, so to speak. But so that's very important to underline that point. But even though maybe I can if I'm allowed to have a sort of as a counter argument, even if there is a larger playing ground when it comes to pastoral practices, and there definitely is in most churches, it's sort of illegal.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
cannot
of
come
course.
out of it openly. The priests that are doing that are sort of,
Yeah.
well, it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be the case that we should say, well, but look at the pastoral practices. No, that's not how it should be. But well, it's better than nothing.
Yeah.
It's the same with the don't ask, don't tell rule that we've come across in a lot of churches. It's well, one way you can say it's working.
Yeah.
Don't ask too much questions and don't tell too much. But it's also not good.
Yeah.
No, of course not. And it never will be truly equal if we're talking about equality,
No.
you know. And I suppose that's the situation that certain people are in their churches, and that's where they, you know, that's just where they are at this moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess from what you were saying, and you also mentioned, people who. Someone mentioned the working group who were almost like in tears while looking through all these results. And I guess that it's kind of, when I was reading it, I had this this thought came to my mind. Okay, I'm not crazy. Because sometimes when you do this work and work in churches or with LGBT people or faith, or are trying to do your best to make life easier for LGBT people of faith, sometimes you just question, am I maybe just making it up? Am I, because the churches are saying, we love you. There are some words like that, or all LGBT people are loved. So there is always this question. But then when you have a proof where you can see, okay, it's not okay. They're not standing up for me when I'm in pain, when I'm suffering, when I don't have some rights, even to some basic rights in my life. So this is important to see, and it's kind of, it makes things in one way, it makes it a little bit easier to know, okay, I'm not crazy. I'm not making things up. It's not just in my head. So thank you for your work that you put into this research, all of you. What about, Rachel, you mentioned intersex people and trans people. What can you say about what this research shows about these topics, or these identities?
Yes, well, whenever we were developing the indicators, and we kept adding more and more on, and we really did try our best to not leave those other categories behind that are often left behind. And yourself, that you'll often see a lot of focus on gay men, lesbian women, cisgendered gay men and lesbian women, and we really wanted to make sure that we were actually inclusive of everybody who falls into the LGBTQI plus family. And we did look at making certain indicators that would shed some light in particular, or go out of our way to be particularly inclusive. And it is difficult because we wanted this research to be for everyone. And it just so happens, as I was saying, that a lot of the focus that's out there, in the public sphere is more focused on certain identities rather than others. And we, from the European Forum, there are a lot of people who are working in particular on raising the profile of those other identities, and that's definitely something that we didn't want to leave behind. And we really tried our best to engage with those communities. My colleagues, would you like to say a little bit more about the actual results of those indicators?
Yeah,
Well,
transgender people, they have got a voice in some of the churches. Church of England, in the Protestant Church in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, to mention just some examples. And this means so that they are acknowledged, visible, being heard, make themselves heard, can associate themselves, and that there are rituals, liturgies for the blessing of a new name, for instance. That is a sign of recognition. You are there, and we not only accept you, but we affirm your being with us in the church. Intersex people is less visible and audible in churches. So it was mentioned a few times also. Well, on transgender people, yes, I can tell you this and that, but on intersex people, usually it is not mentioned in the church. It is not in statements. It is not in pastoral letters. It is simply not there.
Yeah.
And so we only can make this visible in the report that intersex people are not really visible inside the church and not represented in the leadership. So this is one of our let's say steps forward, that transgender and intersex people should be also more represented in the leaderships of the churches, where they can represent also others and be more visible. And we have a special chapter on transgender and the European Church's inclusivity. So perhaps Rijn can add on this.
Yeah, not that much, because I would say that the results on that part, in particular on intersexual people, but also on transsexual people, transgender people, the results are quite disappointing, to be honest. Some of the churches openly said to us, well, churches that are scoring quite high on our list on the ranking say, well, trans identity is not yet an issue. Not yet an issue. So let's hope it will be. But it's compared to some of the other results, the T and the I, the results are quite disappointing, I would say. But that's also maybe that says also something about the maybe it says also something about the different groups within the LGBTI. There's probably some more honoring attention for the LGB and less in general public for the T and the I, although maybe the Ts are making a great case for themselves now, when I look at my country, for instance. But definitely there is a lot to be desired for when it comes to policies and practices and statements from churches in Europe. Yeah.
I think a lot of the
everywhere.
onus.
Yes, Rachel.
Sorry, I was just going to add that I think a lot of, we also need to take it upon ourselves to take on that onus to do the work, because what often happens is where there is a little bit of progress, it's maybe because of one person who happens to be bisexual or non-binary, who then educates others. And then that can also be, that can be emotionally draining for people, that they always have to take on the onus to do the work themselves about their own community, about their own identity. And I think, in terms of sort of recommendations and steps moving forward, and especially for churches that are doing a lot better in terms of scoring a lot higher, would be that, as Ren said, it's not that you can just turn around and say, well, we haven't encountered that. I'm sure you have. You maybe just don't realize that you have, first of all. And it shouldn't be damage control. It shouldn't be that you're waiting for a fire to put out a fire. It should be that you're actually, taking a more, preventative approach, and actually, saying from the beginning, here we are welcoming and affirming to all, and we're not going to wait until we have that barrier to try to, get over that barrier to, cross that bridge when we come to it sort of approach. It should be, the onus should be on everyone to actually take the responsibility to do the work themselves.
Yeah. That would be amazing to see.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, so you already started talking about the way forward. So what would you say is the way forward for churches? And I guess it's very different for different denominations and for individual churches and even within the denominations. But yeah, what would you say to this question? What's the way forward for the churches?
Yeah, well, we as part of the different chapters we wrote, we sort of put in sometimes some steps forward or ways forward, and then we decided to end with a chapter on that's now called ways forward, and we formulated 24 ways forward, starting from nothing to something more. And these could be applied to all churches. And maybe also churches could look at them and say, well, we are already past step 10, for instance, and we're moving to 11, 12, and etc. So it's a sort of a discernment way of discerning where the churches are at the moment. We had some conversation amongst each other if we would call them recommendations. And I didn't like that word recommendations, because in a way they are recommendations, but it might sound a bit too talking down, like we are the researchers and we will recommend to you to do this. It's up to the churches and to the people in the churches. It's not up to us. So we try to look at what would be possible. If you want to do that, what would be the possible steps that you could take heading in a right direction? And in that situation, we sort of formulated 24. The first one, if I'm allowed to mention two of them, the first one is to affirm the unconditional and inalienable human dignity of all persons as children of God. That's sort of a basic acknowledgement, I would say. But number 24 is identify heteronormative language and policies and change them. So we think that that's a step to take for probably most or not all the churches for the moment. So we started at 1 and we ended at 24, and all the churches are somewhere in between. And they can look at the list and say, well, we want to go to number 18 now. Something like that. Yeah.
Churches that are now rather non-inclusive, they can start with recognizing the dignity of all people, and they can start with a pastoral dialogue, or do not promote conversion therapy as a minimum. Huh?
Yeah.
And then churches further on the road, they can say we condemn publicly conversion therapy. And for those who are seemingly inclusive, there are always steps to improve and to become more inclusive. And for instance, there we have as a way forward to have a guided protocol for parishes to become more inclusive, and to have some protocol to monitor if the church is moving ahead in practicing inclusiveness. So not just to state in one declaration we are an inclusive church and the synod is very happy with itself, but is it also really, do you practice what you preach? Is it implemented? And there we learn from those who are best performing today in Europe, and other churches can learn from their examples and their best practices. But again, this is the churches are, some are in the first class in school and others are already in the highest level in school, and it is up to the churches to see, here are we, and what could be for us the next steps forward? If we look into the mirror of this research, and if this mirror doesn't make such a good picture of us, what does it tell us? And what can we do? And then we have some practical steps forward.
Thank you. Is there anything you would like to add, Rachel?
I think a public apology as well is needed to acknowledge past harms that have been done. And, you know, even if you're at the point of, you know, moving forward and you know, rectifying those, you should acknowledge those. And that means a lot to the community as well, in terms of, you know, just having that acknowledgement and from there being able to move forward.
Yeah.
Important that you add this. That is really important.
Find that too.
And only a few churches have done something that looks like a sort of a public apology. Only very few churches. So there is still some ground to be covered there for churches.
Yes. Okay, I just wanted to say a comment, but I'm not going to say it. I don't think it's a good time and place to say that. Well, at the end of this interview, is there something that I didn't ask and it's just important for you to share with our viewers and listeners about this research?
Well, maybe not about the research as such and the research results, but I want to say, and probably Helene also, is that we as researchers are quite grateful to the EF to give us this opportunity. I hope that they will be sort of grateful with the result, meaning the report. And let's hope, as Rachel put it quite well, it's that this is more or less groundbreaking for when you look at churches and LGBTI issues, that this is just the first report of many to come, maybe.
We worked in a great partnership with the European Forum, and that it was just wonderful, and we learned a lot from it. And from the whole research. So it would be, this will work as a benchmarking tool and as a critical instrument for policy and advocacy. If the research is done, let's say every 2 or 3 years, so that you can see the development, the same way as ILGA Europe benchmarking tool is functioning. Because then you can see, what are churches doing with it, and how does it support the LGBTI groups in the countries to work for the next steps, and hopefully the report in a few years will be a better report, that churches really have more points by then than they have now. So that would be, I think, the best reward for our work.
And I would like to thank Helene and Ren as well, of course, because without your expertise, this wouldn't be possible. And of course, I completely agree. You know, that would be the dream, that we could come back to this. And, you know, we started off at 0, so it can only grow. It can, you know, and also in the middle of a global pandemic, you know, we still managed to get this out there, and we still had co-researchers who were willing to give their time and all of their hard work to make this work. But wouldn't it be amazing if this wasn't the end, if this index could then be a tool that we could return to and keep building on this research? That really would be the dream.
Thank you all so much for being my guests. Thank you for doing this research. And one thing I want to point out, what I'm thankful for, is that you worked with the people who are actually at the, let's call it, battlefields, or, you know, who are on the ground, because I sometimes just miss this within research, like a better cooperation between researchers and those people who do the work. So this is what makes this research so amazing for me. That's what I really like about this research. Thank you for your time that you took for this podcast to talk about this research and tell our viewers and listeners what it is all about, and for all those who would like to hear a little bit more. And of course, like for me, it's always exciting to meet the faces behind the names that are written on a research or in an email or wherever it is. So thank you, dear viewers and listeners, for tuning in and for watching this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I really enjoyed and I felt so comfortable talking to all of you. As I said in the beginning, this podcast was made in partnership with the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. There's also going to be a second part. There probably is already a second part. It isn't recorded at this point, but it will be published together with this one. And it's with two European Forum members and workers. And they have so many things they do within the European Forum that will talk a little bit more about the practical application of this research and how it will help us who are doing the work. So thank you again, everyone. I will see you soon in the next podcast. Until then, bye to my guests and to all of you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.